I want to draw your attention to a book that was published in English translation by CPH in 1966. It is called The Theology of the Resurrection by Walter Künneth, who was Werner Ehlert's successor at Erlangen. Künneth published the first edition of Theology of the Resurrection in the significant year 1933. We all remember what happened in 1933. The Austrian corporal became the, you know that man. Well, anyway, and then after the Second World War, he published the second edition. What it is, he looks at Christian theology doctrine, the scriptures, in the light of the resurrection and tries to understand everything in that light. I've read the book about 4 or 5 times, and each time there is something that I learn. And my own sense, it's one of the most important books I've ever read. There are some things that will make you scratch your head, but I highly recommend it. I think it can still be found, old copies online and so forth and so on. But let me just mention that and then get on to my talk, which I've chosen to call Canterbury Tales of a Sasse-phil. And of course, we all know what a Sasse-phil is, someone who is a lover of Hermann Sasse. And in calling myself a Sasse-phil, I guess I'm in rather good company, since the president of our synod is clearly a Sasse-phil, because it's thanks really to Matthew Harrison that so much of Sasse's legacy is now available in the English language. So I am a Sasse-phil. The question addressed in my brief remarks is, how then did it happen that a Sasse-phil wound up in the Anglican Church for over 20 years? I'm also 4th generation Missouri Synod, except for my McClean forebears. All my other great-grandparents were members of Missouri parishes here in Baltimore and in Richmond by the middle of the 19th century. So how did somebody with that sort of background wind up as an Anglican? So first of all, how I became a Sasse-phil. In 1959, Sasse published his book, This Is My Body, Luther's Contention for the Real Presence in the Sacrament of the Altar. And I got that book the year it was published, the year I graduated from the high school across the street. And I immediately became, didn't call myself that, but became a Sasse-phil. In 1961, Pastor Richard Klopf, who for 12 years had been pastor of our church at St. John the Evangelist in Brooklyn, New York, as he left to become an Anglican, he gave me his copy of Sasse's book, Here We Stand, The Nature and Character of the Lutheran Faith. And I just devoured that. And it's, again, a book that I return to again and again and again. And then I found in the library at Bronxville a publication called Lutherische Blätter, edited by Sasse's friend Friedrich Wilhelm Hopp, which published his letters to Lutheran pastors. And I started reading all that. And when Sasse's collection of essays in Statu Confessionis, Volume 1, was published in 1966, I acquired a copy of that, and when In Statu Confessionis 2 was published in 1975, I acquired a copy of that. So I was reading Sasse all those years, and during my years at the St. Louis Seminary, it was, I believe, in 1966, that he was teaching at the seminary graduate courses. I was then an undergraduate. But I did hear a lecture he gave for the whole seminary community, and you can still hear that lecture It's available at the Concordia Seminary St. Louis website. And if my memory serves me correctly, I believe his topic was Luther and the Ecumenical Creeds. Does anyone remember that? I think it was Luther, but it was just a wonderful thing, actually, to hear him speak. And the thing that struck me about him was that he clearly was a man who had suffered in Hitler's Third Reich. And of course, he had suffered in the First World War in the German army. And also, he suffered because of the disintegration of confessional Lutheranism in Germany. It struck me that he was a man who had suffered. I was struck by his conviction, his quiet, steadfast conviction, and also by, I would say, a deep humility. This is the way he struck me as I heard him give this lecture. So I became and I remain a Sasse-phil, but in 1982, I left the Missouri Synod, and I think I could say that had it not been for the synodical controversy of the early 70s, I probably never would have left Synod. I had friends on both sides of the controversy. One of my dearest friends was the late John Dahm, who was academic dean of the St. Louis Seminary and was John Teachin's best friend. John was a very dear friend of mine. At the same time, I was a student of H. Richard Klan. That name may be less familiar to you. He was part of the faculty minority, the 5 professors who did not go along with the Seminex thing, Dr. H. Richard Klan. And I not only was his student, but I wound up becoming his student assistant. And my friends were rather astonished. He was a wonderful theologian, but his personality, well, I once said to one of my classmates who was not that fond of Dr. Klan, generally people were, and I said, well, you know, Bill, I sort of picture Dr. Klan sometimes with one of those Prussian spiked helmets. And Bill Farron said to me, Charles, I can't picture him any other way. But anyway, yeah, so I was close to people on both sides of that argument. And in 1976, I became pastor of an English district parish, St. John's Springfield, where Rob Kieslowski is now pastor, and I served there for 6 years. And the English district, of course, had really, in a way, it was sort of the epicenter of the problem because Teachin and Dahm and so many other people, they were from the English district. And it was just very difficult to, no matter what happened, Winkle Conference, district conventions, social gatherings, there was this this atmosphere of conflict, just the bitterness. And of course, there were real doctrinal issues at stake, but as always, the devil gets in there and he uses egos and personalities to make things far worse than they needed to be. So I just really got very tired of it all. I just, I don't know quite how else to describe it. Those of you who didn't go through that may have a bit of difficulty picturing how it was. Now, my old friend here, Steve Funk, we were at seminary together. We sang in Bob Barrick's chapel choir. And Stephen knows what that was like too, right, Steve? Yeah. It was a dreadful time. I guess I finally came to the point where I see the whole thing. Well, Jaroslav Pelikan once said that the Reformation was a tragic necessity. A tragic necessity. A necessity because the gospel was at stake. A tragedy because the unity of Western Christendom was shattered more than it had been even in the Middle Ages. And I see the whole controversy of the early 1970s in Synod as a tragic necessity. It was a necessity because there were theological developments that, if it had not been stopped, we would have lost our confession. We would have lost the gospel, really. I say it was tragic because it shattered our synod in some ways. And I think we still suffer from that. We are still suffering from that event. As I say, I think in the providence of God, it was necessary because when you look at the condition of the ELCA today and much of LWF Lutheranism, I think you can see what would have become of us had that whole episode of Seminex and the walkout and all that followed not happened. So I just got exhausted with the whole thing. And I remember when Pastor Richard Clough became an Anglican, a few years after that, I was having a conversation with Arthur Carl Peepcorn about it. And Father Peepcorn said to me, he said, well, you know, Charles, I think Father Richard's departure for the Anglican Church was emotional. It had very little to do with doctrine. And that's my reading of that too. And I think in my own experience, it was more an emotional thing than it had anything to do with doctrine. At the same time, I had close friends who were Anglicans. I knew a lot about Anglicanism. Yes. Your handout here, you look at the first page. One of the things that has only become clear to me in recent years is how well acquainted Dr. Sasse, in fact, was with Anglicans and Anglicanism. That really had somehow never registered with me. If you look at the picture on the first of my handout, there is a picture of a meeting in 1936 at the home of the then Archbishop of York, William Temple. And in the front row in the middle is William Temple, the Archbishop of York, who went on to be Archbishop of Canterbury. And the person second from the left in the front row is Dr. Sasse. Above Dr. Sasse is Edward Roche Hardy, who was a patristic scholar. And just above Archbishop Temple, the clergyman there is a very young Michael Ramsey. He had hair at that time. You can see a picture of him down here on the right when he, in due course, he eventually became Bishop of Durham, Archbishop of York, and Archbishop of Canterbury, as did William Temple. So my reason for including this picture is just sort of a visual aid in showing Sasse's acquaintance with the Anglicans. And he was very much in touch with Archbishop Temple during the Kirchenkampf in Germany. He remained in touch with William Temple through that whole time. So, questions so far? Any questions? The next thing in the handout is an outline of Sasse's life. Then there is a select bibliography of Sasse. And then there is an outline of Anglican history. And perhaps my own experience of Anglicanism can be somewhat clarified by just briefly reviewing Anglicanism. As you all know, Anglicanism is not one thing, but many things, and it basically has those three streams of the Catholic emphasis, the evangelical emphasis, and the third emphasis, I think, could be described as humanist. And then there's the popular way of explaining it, high church crazy, low church lazy, broad church hazy. That's the various groups within the Anglican Church. And my experience of Anglicanism was definitely within the Catholic stream of Anglicanism. If you look at this outline of history, you'll notice first the act of supremacy of Henry VIII, whereby the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome was rejected, but nothing was changed in the doctrine of the Church. In 1547, Edward VI became king, a boy king, and his advisors and council were people sympathetic to the Reformation. And so in that's a terrible mistake, 1549, that's a typo, 1549, the first Book of Common Prayer. And that book displays significant Lutheran influence. Any number of Lutherans, such as Henry Eyster Jacobs and Arthur Karl Piepkorn and Luther Dotterer Reed and others, very much point to the Lutheran emphasis in the first Book of Common Prayer. But then, once the prayer book was published, the reaction of the Reformed element in England was, well, what would you say? It was very negative. And one of the things that was objected to was that in the liturgy for Holy Communion, there was so much that pointed to the doctrine of the real presence. And in 1552, the revision of the prayer book in that year eliminated everything that could possibly be construed as pointing to the real presence. In the 1549 prayer book, the formula of distribution was the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. In the 1552 book, the formula of distribution is just take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Everything in the 1549 book that could be construed as pointing to the real presence was ruthlessly excised. And it was not only Lutheran-minded people who found reference to the real presence in the 1549 book. It was also such people as Bishop Stephen Gardiner, one of the English bishops who remained loyal to the Roman Catholic faith. And Gardiner, too, pointed out where in this liturgy you could find the real presence. So all of that was ruthlessly excised, and that book was very explicitly Zwinglian, not even Calvinist. It really was Zwinglian. And then, of course, in 1553, Queen Mary came to the throne. We know her as Bloody Mary. The Roman religion was restored. And then 5 years later, Elizabeth I came to the throne. And in 1559, there is what is called the Elizabethan settlement of religion. The 1559 Book of Common Prayer was published, in which the explicit Zwinglianism of the 1552 prayer book was rejected, but it was a compromise. And the compromise is made plain in the formula for distributing the sacrament. What happened in the 1559 book is that the formula of distribution from 1549 and 1552 were combined. And that has remained in the Anglican liturgy to this day. So the formula for distributing Christ's body became the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee. Preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. So the two formulae were joined together, and similarly with the formula of distribution for the cup. So there was that ambivalence. And the liturgical texts themselves, in a sense, can best be construed as Calvinist. And Anglican Eucharistic teaching from that time became largely a Calvinist understanding of the Lord's Supper. But the settlement of 1559 didn't really settle things decisively. Anglicanism has always been very much a work in process. And what happened in the 17th century is that there were Anglican theologians who, instead of looking to the Roman Church or looking to the Reformed Church on the continent, they looked back to the ancient church, to the patristic witness, and looked especially to the witness of the Greek fathers, and also then looked to the witness of Eastern Orthodoxy. So in the 17th century, you have these Anglican theologians who try to reappropriate the patristic witness and begin to have this interest and affinity for the Eastern Orthodox Church. These theologians are called the Caroline divines. Have you ever heard that expression? The Caroline divines. Divines in the sense of theologians. In the King James Version, the book of the Revelation is the revelation of St. John the Divine, meaning St. John the theologian. So the Caroline divines or theologians, they're called Caroline because two of the kings in the 17th century were Charles I and Charles II. So that's why those people are called the Caroline divines. And perhaps the most prominent of them, in a sense, was Lancelot Andrewes, the Bishop of Winchester. And I cannot remember the reference, perhaps some of you will know it, but some years ago there was a Lutheran who studied at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he did a doctoral dissertation on the Eucharistic doctrine of Lancelot Andrewes. And the result of his dissertation, he contended that Lancelot Andrewes' doctrine was very close to what the Lutheran Church confesses. So that gives you some kind of sense of 17th century Anglicanism. In 1688, James II was deposed. He was a Roman Catholic, and the Parliament was not about to have a Roman Catholic there. And so he was sent packing, and William and Mary became co-sovereigns. Some of the bishops found themselves unable in conscience to swear allegiance to William and Mary because they had sworn allegiance to James II. And so they became known as the non-jurors, the ones who wouldn't swear the oath of allegiance to William and Mary. And the non-jurors were very much in the Caroline tradition, and they were also very interested in the patristic witness and the witness of Eastern Orthodoxy. Then comes the 18th century with the Enlightenment and all the misery that caused. There was the evangelical revival in England and then the work of John Wesley. So we go on to the 19th century and the beginning of the so-called Catholic movement in the Anglican Church, the movement to recover the ancient Catholic heritage of the Church. It begins in 1833, and what precipitated it was that in 1833, the Parliament eliminated several bishoprics in the Anglican Church of Ireland. And this was alarming to any number of the Anglican clergy. And so on July 14th, 1833, John Keble, who was a fellow of Oriel College, Oxford, preached a sermon in the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which was called National Apostasy. National apostasy in the wake of parliaments. The parliament somehow had attacked the church, that it had gotten its hands into the sacred things of the church. And so it was Keble's sermon was a call to recover the church itself, the church's own authority. And then began the publication of the so-called Tracts for the Times. And the very first tract for the Times was written by John Henry Newman, who in due course became a Roman Catholic. And the first of the Tracts for the Times was called Our Apostolic Descent. And what Newman did in that tract, he posed this question: in the light of the fact that Parliament has now abolished these Irish bishoprics, which raises the specter that the church also in England may no longer be the established church, that, will no longer be the established church. So if we lose our place as the establishment, on what do we base our authority? And it was in that tract that Newman proclaimed the doctrine of the apostolic succession of bishops. In other words, that our authority is the fact that we are bishops and then the priests ordained by them are the successors of the apostles. That was Newman's contention. And this really is the first time in Anglicanism that the episcopate was seen as essential to the church's life. The episcopate had been retained, but even the Caroline divines who valued it never supposed that it was essential. In other words, that to have a valid ministry and sacraments, you had to have bishops ordained in this alleged succession from the apostles. But the Tractarians did teach that. And of course, that also has been the teaching of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And along with the emphasis on the episcopate, there was the emphasis of recovering a patristic doctrine of the sacraments and the whole life of the church. And in the wake of that, there were the beginnings of the recovery of the ceremonial of the Middle Ages, which had been lost. It's interesting that whereas in Scandinavian Lutheranism, the use of the Mass vestments continued without interruption from the time of the Reformation today, the use of those vestments was lost in the Anglican Church in the 16th century. And even the use of a cross on the altar was lost. That too was looked at as a Well, they were Calvinists, and these are images that you mustn't have, even the image of the cross. So it wasn't until this 19th century so-called Catholic revival that even the use of the cross was recovered among Anglicans. And lighted candles on the altar were unthinkable too. There was a big fight about that. And the celebrant of the Eucharist, instead of standing on the side of the altar with the people looking east, the celebrant stood at the north end of the altar, looking sideways. That's how it was celebrated from the 17th century to the 19th century. And there was a tremendous fight over the recovery of the so-called eastward position. So anyway, all of this happened. And then if you'll go to the next page, in 1867, there was the first Lambeth Conference of the Anglican bishops. The then Archbishop of Canterbury invited all the Anglican bishops to come and meet with him at his home of Lambeth Palace in London. Because of all the turmoil that the Anglican Church throughout the world was experiencing with the Oxford movement, the Anglo-Catholic revival, and so forth and so on. 1889 is an important date because in that year, a collection of essays by Anglo-Catholic theologians led by Charles Gore was published called Lux Mundi. And it was the beginnings of what has been called liberal Catholicism. The Tractarians all rejected the historical criticism of the Bible. This was something they did not accept. And it was in Lux Mundi that you began to have an acceptance of this in some sense. In 1893, the Pope condemned the validity of Anglican ordinations in his apostolic letter, Apostolicae Curae. So that's sort of a very quick look at some of Anglican history. Yes.
Does the Lux Mundi have its parallel in the Lumen Gentium?
Well, Lumen Gentium was more on the doctrine of the church, wasn't it? Or what at the Second Vatican Council, what was the thing that dealt with divine revelation? Was that Lumen Gentium? Does anyone remember? We should remember. The doctrine, maybe.
Orientation towards, finding the light or finding the truth.
Yeah, perhaps it was Lumen Gentium. But the Second Vatican Council did address the question of revelation. Yeah, did address the question of revelation. Yeah. So anyway, that gives you some kind of sense of how Anglicanism developed. And then what follows here is the chronicle of how the ordination of women came into the Anglican Church. And the reason I put that there is that the introduction of the ordination of women is really the thing that more or less unsettled the settlement of 1559, the Elizabethan settlement. As long as the ministry of bishops, priests, and deacons was in place, as long as the Book of Common Prayer was in use by all Anglicans, the thing somehow held together. But once you get the ordination of women, then among Anglicans, you no longer have mutual recognition of ministry and sacraments, so you have a schism. And how that all came about is chronicled here. The beginning, in 1944, the Bishop of Hong Kong ordained a woman. The Archbishop of Canterbury demanded that the bishop repudiate the action. In 1948, the Lambeth Conference rejected the Anglican province of China's request to permit the ordination of women to the priesthood. In 1968, the Lambeth Conference asked that the question be studied, but nobody do anything without consultation. 1971, the Bishop of Hong Kong ordains 2 women to the priesthood. 1973, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church refuses to accept the ordination of women. 1973, 3 retired Episcopal bishops illegally ordained 11 women to the priesthood in Philadelphia. The next year, a retired bishop ordains 4 more women illegally. In 1976, the General Convention accepted the ordination of women. And then this Declaration of St. Louis, what happened in the wake of that General Convention is that Anglicans who wanted to maintain the traditional Anglican faith and order, there was this big meeting in St. Louis, and they adopted the Declaration of St. Louis, in which they affirmed their adherence to the doctrine and practice of the ancient undivided church, including, of course, the rejection of the ordination of women. And then the next year, one retired Anglican bishop, Albert Chambers, assisted by a bishop of the Philippine Independent Church, which had its roots in the Roman Church. These were Filipino Catholics who left the Roman Church and had their own church. Bishop Pagtacan was his name. He and Bishop Chambers ordained 4 bishops for continuing Anglicans at a service held in Augustana Lutheran Church in Denver. 1989, the first Anglican woman bishop was ordained. 1992, the Church of England accepts the ordination of women. Then in 2009, through the publication on November 4th of Anglicanorum Cedibus, Pope Benedict XVI established the Anglican Ordinariate, a structure for Anglicans who wish to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome whilst retaining Anglican tradition. And then finally, in 2014, the Church of England accepted the ordination of women to the episcopate. When I became an Anglican in 1982, in the Episcopal Church, a third of the bishops still refused to ordain women. And the then presiding bishop, John Maury Allen, he too refused to accept it. So there was, at that point, there was some sense that perhaps it wouldn't prevail, but that was a foolish thought. It was a done deal. And during my years in the Anglican Church, what happened is that not only was the ordination of women accepted, but then inevitably, I believe, you also had the acceptance of the LGBTQ agenda. And it was those developments that finally by the year 2008, I had come to the point where I could no longer in good conscience continue to function in that church body. Because as an Episcopal priest, you function on behalf of your bishop. And I could no longer function as a clergyman on behalf of bishops who not only ordained women to the priesthood, but had rejected Christ's institution of marriage. I mean, the acceptance of the LGBTQ, et cetera, all those letters, they seem to multiply. When you accept that, you're rejecting what the Creator has established. You're rejecting what Christ established and taught. And so really, it finally affects the heart of the Christian faith. In my handout, let's see, on page 6 here, a short Anglican bibliography for Lutherans. These are resources that would help you to understand what Anglicanism is all about. And down there is C.S. Lewis's essay, Priestesses in the Church. Have any of you read this? Everybody should. C.S. Lewis wrote that in 1948 in the run-up to the Lambeth Conference, when the Lambeth Conference was going to address this issue. And in there, Lewis very carefully shows how the acceptance of the ordination of women is not simply a change in the nature of the church's ministry, but it in fact involves a repudiation of the whole divine revelation as given in Holy Scripture. Because throughout Holy Scripture, the relationship of God and his people is given under the imagery of the husband and the wife, the bridegroom and the bride. And this we see in the New Testament, most especially in Ephesians 5, where St. Paul speaks of marriage. This is a great mystery, and it means Christ and the church. So once you start changing the nature of the ministry, you also are, it leads to the unraveling of divine revelation. And this too is inevitably seen because in the Psalter in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, which I believe is still the Psalter used in Elka's present service book, all the masculine references of pronouns for God are eliminated. See, they're all eliminated. And so you have this rejection of divine revelation. It really finally is a rejection of the Holy Trinity. It just, the whole thing unravels. So I highly recommend it, priestesses in the church. And in the light of what happened since then, I think that it can be seen as a prophetic essay. The second thing on the bibliography is by Donald Olshan, NFS Grundtvig, an introduction to his life of art. Grundtvig was a 19th century Danish Lutheran bishop. Are we familiar at all with Grundtvig? We all know his hymn, Built on the Rock, the Church Doth Stand. But this study by Donald Olshan, he traces patristic themes in the writings and the hymnody of Bishop Grundtvig. It's really a labor of love, and it gives another insight into Scandinavian Lutheranism. You'll also notice on this bibliography the book by Yngve Brilioth, The Anglican Revival Studies in the Oxford Movement. Yngve Brilioth was a Swedish Lutheran who became the Archbishop of Uppsala. And this is his study of the Anglican Revival, the Oxford Movement. Eucharistic Faith and Practice is his study of the Sacrament of the Altar, and I highly recommend that to you too. On the very back of my handout, there's a picture of the Swedish bishops with King Gustav VI Adolf, the predecessor of the present King of Sweden. He's in the middle. Archbishop Brilioth is on the right. Bishop Alain is on the left, and Bishop Bogertz, with whom I'm sure we're all familiar, is on the right. This has been a somewhat disjointed presentation, I'm afraid, but I hope it's given you some kind of sense of my own personal experience of life in our synod, and also how I happened to wind up as an Anglican. You can be a Lutheran in the Anglican Church if you can get over scruples about altar and pulpit fellowship. If you can get over that, you can be a Lutheran in the Anglican Church. But you can also be a Unitarian. You can be Eastern Orthodox. You can be an absolutely strict Calvinist.
I think same in Missouri Synod too.
And, you can, Anglicanism, I mean, to say high and crazy, low and lazy, broad and lazy, Catholic, evangelical, humanist, it doesn't do justice to all the variations there. Because within Anglo-Catholicism, you have a group that looks to Eastern Orthodoxy, and they're Anglo-Orthodox. And as an Anglican, I think I was sort of an Anglo-Orthodox. But there's also the Anglican Papalists. And they are Anglicans who accept every point of Roman Catholic doctrine and practice, including the infallibility of the Pope. Guess what point of Roman Catholic doctrine they reject? No, oh, no, they affirm that. No. The Roman condemnation of Anglican orders, Leo XIII's condemnation. Yes, you may well laugh. Yes. Everything else, the Holy Father has said it, we believe it. But that, we make a mental reservation. And it's very strange. It's a very strange phenomenon. But as I say, there are many Anglicans who are very close to us in their doctrine. But it is as I say, you can be almost anything else. Yes, Tom.
How different would it be if we were here in the Baltimore area,
Yeah.
on a Sunday to visit? And this is what they do in one location, and then 10 miles away, another one. Would we see the difference immediately? Or would there be much of a difference?
Well, there would be some difference. There would be differences. There are still in this diocese, in this Episcopal diocese, there are still some parishes that maintain Anglo-Catholic worship, but at the same time they accept women priests and the LGBTQ thing. And most, I would say, you would be hard-pressed to find a parish in the Diocese of Maryland that does not accept the LGBTQ thing. That has become almost it's part of their core identity. It's their mission. It's their mission. I mean, at the same time, they're remnants of the gospel. But this LGBT thing you would find. And yes, they in some sense use the prayer book, but that too, you'd find some variations in practice too. And while the official Book of Common Prayer of 1979 is in general recognizably Christian, there are alternative liturgies in which you can omit referring to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and where God is addressed as Mother, this type of thing. It's chaos, yes.
Would it be similar to the differences that we could see if we went to a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod congregation here and one 10 miles away?
I think the average Episcopal church today is pretty similar. There used to be more of a difference. There were the definitely Anglo-Catholic churches, there were the definitely low churches, there were the definitely broad churches, but now it has become sort of a monochrome, mainline Protestant denomination.
I guess I'm referring to style of worship.
Style of worship.
In other words, we have Missouri Synod congregations that are completely contemporary.
Yeah. You'd find some of those in the Episcopal Church too. Yeah, you'd find that. Yeah. It's sad. I mean, there are strengths in Anglicanism, and Sasse himself recognized those strengths. The Cranmer's liturgy is in many respects a treasure, and through the Common Service of 1888, the English-speaking Lutherans, basically our liturgy is essentially taken from the language of the Book of Common Prayer. Yeah. Yes.
How do you understand like diminishing influence of the Puritans after the English Civil War? Like, at what point did their impact on the Anglican Church?
Yeah.
Are they completely pushed aside?
Yeah. I think what happened is in 1660, Charles II is restored to the throne. And in 1662, the 1662 prayer book is imposed. And all of the things the Puritans asked for were rejected. All the things they wanted to get rid of in the Anglican Church, the episcopate, the liturgy, the vestments, all of that was rejected. So they just were, they left. I think that's what happened, basically. They just left. The Puritans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just seems like in Germany, the Calvinists always won.
Well, yes, that does seem to be the story, isn't it? Yes, yes.
But not as much in church. I feel like.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
J.I. Packer was a Puritan, right?
Well, I would say he's more a traditional, in the Anglican sense, evangelical Anglican. I mean, he's essentially Calvinist in his doctrine, but he also...
Or he said heaven now, he's a Lutheran.
Oh, right, of course. He was a Calvinist. But J.I. Packer was one who valued the prayer book. But now among evangelical Anglicans, there are those who reject the prayer book. I mean, in London, the great evangelical parish is All Souls Langham Place. Have you heard of that? All Souls Langham Place. I can't remember the name of the famous rector there. But it was the center of evangelical Anglican. It used to be a prayer book parish. Now, they don't use the prayer book. The clergy are in street dress. It's like a contemporary worship thing. I cannot remember the name of that.
Nicky Gumble?
Oh, no, that's Holy Trinity over in Brompton, I think. Yeah, Nicky Gumbel's church, yeah.
You lived through much of the descent of the Anglican Church.
I did.
So to what, could you see any parallels in what's going on in the Lutheran Church of Australia?
Oh, I think so, yes, yes. I mean, I think the tragedy of the Australian church, here they had Herman Sasse among them from 1949 till his death in 1976. They had Sasse there. And now the Australian church has permitted the ordination of women. And of course, that's resulted in schism. And they're apparently, some of you are probably more familiar with this than I am, but there is going to be a sort of continuing Lutheran church. Bishop, what is his name from Finland? Bishop Pojola? Yeah. And Dr. John Stevenson's, they were down in Australia to meet with the Lutherans who want to continue as confessional Lutherans. And as a result of their visit there, a young Australian pastor who's a confessional Lutheran, he was able to was called to a parish in Winnipeg, Manitoba, of our sister church in Canada. I met him at St. Michael's conference, and he had hoped to come here, but the airline fares are so ruinously expensive that he wasn't able to do it. Can't remember his name, but he's an example of Sean, what's his last name? I know it as well as my own, Sean. Delightful person, really. I was hoping he could be here. But no, there are parallels with Australia. Yeah. Let me just mention here Michael Ramsey. Sasse admired him. Sasse described Michael Ramsey as a truly learned theologian with deep convictions. And his books in the bibliography on page 6 here. Ramsey, yeah, Canterbury Essays and Addresses. The Glory of God in the Transfiguration of Christ. That is an excellent study of the Transfiguration in the light of Holy Scripture. The Resurrection of Christ, an essay in biblical theology, that is an excellent study of the New Testament on the resurrection of Christ. The Gospel in the Catholic Church is an effort to understand the episcopate as something signifying the unity and continuity of the church, but not as something that constitutes the unity and continuity of the church. So Archbishop Ramsey, his writings are worth some attention, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? I hope this has made some sense. Yes, Jay.
Commented about the essentially emotional reasons why
Yes.
you left
Yes.
the Missouri Synod and
Yes.
became Episcopalian.
Yes.
Can you talk about how you came back and what were you thinking and what caused you to make that decision?
Okay. My last position in the Anglican Church, I was the assistant priest at Mount Calvary, Baltimore, historic Anglo-Catholic church, the first Episcopal church to have the daily Mass. I'd known it since I was a teenager. I was assistant there, and the new rector, Father Jason Catania, who remains a dear friend of mine, Jason had come to the conclusion that the only solution was to go to Rome. And Jason decided that he would take Mount Calvary to Rome. And I knew that I could not follow him to Rome. And this sort of brought the whole thing to a crisis. What should I do? So that year, in June of 2008, I went to a conference at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in Crestwood, New York. And one of the speakers at this conference was Bishop Callistus Ware. I also recommend his writings to you. His book, The Orthodox Way, I think my dear parishioner Richard Brown discovered Bishop Ware's. What was your reaction to it, Richard?
I think it's the best thing that's been written since C.S. Lewis.
The best thing written. It is, and on C.S. I would say what Bishop Ware does there, it's mere Christianity. It really is. But anyway, Bishop Ware was the speaker there, and I had known of him since 1963 when one of my senior college classmates went to Orthodoxy and gave me Bishop Ware's, well, he was then Timothy Ware, a convert to Orthodoxy, on the Orthodox Church. So I had an opportunity to speak with Bishop Ware. And I said to Bishop Callistus, I said, I really don't know what to do. I know I can't go to Rome. Should I become Orthodox, or should I return to the Lutheran Church? What should I do? And Bishop Ware said to me, he said, well, do not be in haste. Seek God's guidance in prayer, and he will show you what to do. And within a few weeks, I discovered Emmanuel Church in Alexandria on the web. One Sunday when I didn't have anything to do, I went in disguise to the divine service and crept in and sat in the back. And Pastor Esgett celebrated the Eucharist and preached. And my reaction was, this is the most reverent celebration of the Eucharist I think I have ever attended. And the sermon also touched me. And so I got in touch with Father Christopher and I said, can we have lunch? And we did. And, you know, it was clear this is what I should do. So I thank Bishop Ware for what he said to me. I think God spoke to me through Bishop Kallistos. Yeah, yeah. And my heart had never left the Lutheran Church, really. Part of returning to synod, you know, you have to be interviewed by a panel of district presidents. And at the end of the interview, one of them said to me, well, Charles, I don't think you ever really left. One of my dearest friends was Bishop Roger Patelko, also Charles Evanson. Also, George Borneman, the English district bishop, was a fatherly friend to me, and all three of them tried to talk me out of becoming an Anglican. They tried very hard. It didn't work. But no, so my return, I think, as I look back on my life, God had his way, that he, through things that at the time I thought were just ghastly, that God used them for his good purposes. And I have a lot of gratitude for my experiences as an Anglican. I met some perfectly wonderful people. One of them being the Reverend Mother Virginia, who for over 30 years was Mother Superior of the All Saints Sisters in Catonsville outside Baltimore. Mother Virginia lived to be 103 and was one of my dearest friends. She was present at my installation here at Our Saviour. And I had lived for a year on the grounds of the convent and had served the sisters at their altar. So it was a very close, and I also had been friends with their longtime chaplain, Father Maddox, SSJE, who was one of the holiest and funniest people I've ever known in my life. And I miss Mother Virginia because the two of us, we would reminisce about Father Maddox because he was chaplain through much of Mother Virginia's time there. So, and there were people, there were saintly people that I met. One was Bishop Stephen Neal. He came and spoke at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, when I was a student there. And it was very interesting, Martin Franzman's comment about Bishop Neal. Having heard Bishop Neal speak, Franzman said, you know, I used to think that Sasse and Bishop Neal were way apart, but I think they're rather close. So there were lots of, and then I'll never forget a homily that was given on St. Simon and Jude's Day at the Episcopal Church I first joined, Church of the Good Shepherd Rosemont, Father Andrew Mead, whom John Stevenson knew as a young man in England. Father Andrew Mead, that homily said, our only claim on God is the blood of Christ. Our only claim on God is the blood of Christ. And that has stuck in my mind all this time. So in all that turmoil, confusion, and disarray, God was very kind to me. Yes, Rob.
What was your evaluation of the continuing Anglican movement, and to what degree, you know, I mean, why did you not find refuge?
Rob, I think finally the answer is I am a Lutheran. I mean, I do embrace the Augsburg Confession. And I wish them well. And I think that there are many continuing Anglicans. There's one of their bishops, Paul Hewitt, who is, I knew him years and years ago, and then he often he used to come to the Confession Symposium at Fort Wayne. That's where I most recently saw him, Paul Hewitt. He's Bishop of the Diocese of the Holy Cross, and he has Swedish roots, like Pastor Coates over here. He's one of these Swedes. But Paul Hewitt, I wish them well. And I think now the ACNA, that group, I think the problem there is some of their dioceses accept the ordination of women, and that is inevitably going to bring them down. And the few Anglo-Catholic dioceses in ACNA, they increasingly realize that this isn't going to work. So I don't know. there are many questions here. And I suppose one of the things I would say, and we'll have to close so we can get to Pastor Felber's homebrew. Never mind about Vespers. It seems to me that given the circumstances in which we as Christians live today, we in the Missouri Synod, I think we have to find some way to help the remaining Lutherans in the ELCA. We have to find some way to help them, because there still are faithful Lutheran pastors and congregations in that church. And we have to find some way to help them. And my impression is, and some of you know a lot more about this than I do, my impression is that our German sister church, Selk, that they're better at doing that with the remaining confessional Lutherans in the Landeskirchen, that they're better at reaching out to them than we are perhaps. Yes, Tom?
But can you help someone that doesn't think they need help?
No. No, you can't. No, you can't. And if they don't think they need help, there's nothing to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what the answers are, but there are some questions I think we would do well to think about. Yes, Elliot.
I don't need to take much time, but
Yeah.
as a somewhat personal note from a local church,
Yes.
it was a blessed and very sweet day. When in your return to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in an official manner, we were able to invite you to the pulpit of Martini Lutheran Church, church of your growing up, and have you preach. And I believe we handed you one of your books to sign.
Yes.
But it was a great day for the
Oh,
congregation to have you in the midst.
oh, that was a sweet day for me because Martini is my home church. There I was baptized, confirmed, and ordained. Yes, yes. And I was telling several of you this morning that I sometimes think that the nicest thing I've ever heard from anyone was the late Pastor Engelbert, who baptized, confirmed me, and preached my ordination. His wife, Clara Engelbert, she was a wonderful lady, the Lady Clara. Oh my goodness, wonderful, wonderful. But the first time I preached at Martini, after the service, Mrs. Engelbert came up to me and she said, "Das war ein recht evangelisch Predigt." And that made me happier, I think, than anything I've ever heard. That was a truly evangelical sermon. Das war ein recht evangelisch Predigt. Yes, yes. Yes, Clara Engelbert. It also made me very happy that at my installation here, not only was Mother Virginia present, but also Miss Margaret Krantz, who was my kindergarten Sunday school teacher at Martini. She knew me as a 5-year-old. And to have those two women there, Mother Virginia and Miss Margaret, and Miss Margaret continued to teach Sunday school into her 90s.
On Sunday school went for a total of 73 years.
There you are. Well, you know, the saying is at Martini, jobs are a life sentence. My father's godmother was secretary of the Altar Guild for 60 years. My godfather, Herb Keeney, he was president of the congregation until he dropped dead. And in 1971, and then Marty Stalin took over, and he was president of the congregation until he died. And when was that, Elliot?
He was 89 years old.
Yeah, it was 10 years ago, something like that. So that's Martini. Okay, we must get to Vespers.
What time do you want to start?